She thought her life had sunk with her husband's boat, but years later, a single message from her daughter would reopen a chest that changed everything. Love, betrayal, and hidden millions lay buried beneath Oregon's roaring waves. Before we dive into the full story, tell us in the comments where you're listening from. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more heart-touching stories like this one. Now, let's begin. The wind off the Pacific came cold that morning, sharp with the taste of salt and rain. It swept over the cliffs of Cannon Beach, rattling the windows of the weathered cliff house that had been Vivian Locke's shelter for almost half her life. The house creaked and sighed like it remembered the man who built it, Grant Locke, her husband, her anchor, gone to sea and never returned. Vivian stood by the window, wrapped in a heavy wool shawl, staring at the line where gray sky met gray water. Her tea had gone cold hours ago. The horizon always looked the same, wide, endless, merciless. Every morning since Grant's death, she'd watched the waves as if they might give something back. Her phone buzzed, a message from Nora. She blinked at the screen, unsure if her old eyes were reading it right. "Sold the cliff house and your sailboat, Mom. Off to Hawaii for my yoga retreat empire. Love you." Vivian froze. The words didn't make sense, sold the cliff house. Her sailboat, she felt her knees weaken. For a moment, she thought she'd misread it, that maybe Nora meant something else. But the message was clear. Her daughter had sold everything. The breath left her lungs in a trembling gasp. She sat down hard on the worn armchair by the fireplace, the same one where Grant used to read nautical charts at night. "Oh, Nora, what have you done?" she whispered. Outside, gulls screamed above the cliffs, their cries like mocking laughter. Vivian closed her eyes, and the past came rushing back, the night of the storm, the call from the Coast Guard, the empty sea. She remembered how she'd clutched Nora, then just a young woman full of dreams and anger, promising they would survive somehow. And they did. Vivian had sold off bits of land, taken part-time work, pretended it didn't hurt when her daughter left for the city chasing yoga, wellness, and self-empowerment. But this was betrayal. Her fingers trembled as she dialed Nora's number. It rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. "Nora, it's Mom. Call me back, please. I don't understand what's happening." The line beeped, silence again. Vivian stood up slowly, walked toward the hallway. The old boards creaked under her slippers. On the far end of the corridor, there was a door she hadn't opened in years, Grant's study. She reached for the knob. It turned stiffly, as if reluctant to let her in. The room smelled faintly of tobacco and salt air. The desk was still covered with dust, and on the shelf above it sat a small, iron-banded chest, Grant's chest. He had told her never to open it, not unless something happened to him. Vivian's pulse quickened. Her heart, fragile but fierce, pounded like surf against rock. She dragged the chest down carefully. The iron was cold against her hands. She found the old brass key still tied to the string inside his compass case. The lock clicked open. Inside lay yellowed papers, a few photographs, and something wrapped in oilskin. She unrolled it slowly, deeds, stock certificates, timber rights. Her eyes widened. The names of companies she vaguely remembered from Grant's old conversations, but the numbers, they made no sense. $9 million? She breathed. She sat there frozen. For years, she had lived modestly, patching roofs and budgeting groceries, while her husband's hidden wealth slept in that box. Her first thought was Nora, how many times her daughter had said, "Mom, you don't understand the world anymore." And yet, here it was, a world of money her daughter could never imagine. Vivian spent the night reading every paper, tracing every signature. When dawn came, she sat by the window again, but this time the sea looked different, not cruel, but waiting. She didn't call Nora that morning. She didn't tell a soul. Weeks passed. Nora's voice only came through social media posts, glowing captions about her new mindfulness retreat empire in Hawaii, all oceanfront villas and sunset yoga shots. Vivian watched quietly, unseen, as the headlines began to shift. Yoga guru faces fraud allegations. Retreat empire collapses amid scandal. Vivian's hands trembled as she read each one. The empire had crumbled as fast as it rose. Nora's followers turned on her, accusing her of lies, fake testimonials, unpaid staff. Then one rainy evening, there was a knock at Vivian's door. She opened it and there stood Nora, drenched, pale, eyes red-rimmed. "Mom," she whispered, "I had nowhere else to go." Vivian didn't speak for a moment. The sea roared behind her like an old god watching judgment unfold. "Come in," she said finally. Nora stepped inside, her designer luggage soaked through. She looked around the familiar house, now bare and cold. I thought you sold it." Vivian smiled faintly. "No, darling, you did." Nora flinched. "I'm sorry, Mom, I was desperate. I thought I could make something of my life." "I know," Vivian said quietly. "Sit by the fire, you look frozen." As she handed Nora a blanket, she felt something shift inside her, anger softening, replaced by something heavier, pity, sorrow, love. Later that night, while Nora slept on the couch, Vivian returned to the study. She took out the chest, touched the papers again, and whispered, "Grant, maybe this is what it was for." The next morning, she told Nora the truth. About the fortune, about the chest, about everything Grant had left behind. Nora's jaw fell open. 9 million? Mom, that's unbelievable. We could. Vivian held up a hand. "We will do nothing, Nora. You will." "Do you mean?" "I'm giving you a chance," she said softly, "to learn what wealth really means. You'll work for it, not in luxury retreats or false gurus, but here on this shore, cleaning what the sea throws back at us." For weeks, Nora protested, argued, cried, but Vivian was unmoved. Each dawn, they went down to the beach with gloves and sacks, collecting trash and driftwood. Locals stared. Some laughed. Others joined. Slowly, word spread, the disgraced yoga influencer now leading coastal cleanups. At first, Nora did it with resentment. Then something changed. She began to talk less about followers and more about fishermen, veterans, lost families. She met an old Marine who'd lost both legs to war but still came to help. She began leading mindfulness sessions for them by the sea, teaching breathing, silence, forgiveness. Vivian watched from afar, proud but quiet. One evening, as the sun bled red over the horizon, Nora came to her, barefoot and smiling faintly. "Mom," she said, "I think I finally understand. Paradise isn't somewhere you fly to. It's something you build inside." Vivian's eyes glistened. She looked toward the waves, the same sea that took Grant, the same sea that gave her back her daughter. She whispered, "He'd be proud of you." Nora leaned against her shoulder. "Of us." Wind carried the scent of salt and cedar. Far below, the surf thundered, eternal and restless. Vivian closed her eyes and thought, sometimes, the sea takes everything, only to return what matters most. The days along Oregon's coast turned colder. The mornings came wrapped in fog, the kind that swallowed sound and made even the cliffs look like ghosts of themselves. Vivian had grown used to the rhythm again, the crash of waves, the cries of gulls, the slow scrape of her boots over the wet sand. Beside her, Nora worked silently. It had been 3 months since her daughter's return. The newspapers had moved on to fresher scandals. The online mobs had found new prey. And here, in the solitude of the coast, Nora had begun to shed the last traces of her old self, the manic influencer smile, the restless hunger for validation. Each morning, she joined her mother in clearing plastic, tangled nets, and driftwood from the beach. Sometimes they'd talk, sometimes the silence said more. One morning, as they hauled up a half-buried crate, Nora looked at the sea and whispered, "It's strange. I used to come to beaches for photos. Now I come to listen." Smiled faintly. "The sea doesn't talk much, but it listens better than people." Nora nodded. "Maybe that's why I feel safe here." They both turned as the wind picked up, tossing salt spray across their faces. Far offshore, clouds gathered thick, dark, slow. A storm was coming. That evening, back at the house, Vivian stood by the window watching the first lightning flash. Rain began to pepper the glass. The air smelled of pine and ozone. Nora was in the kitchen, humming softly as she stirred soup on the stove. For a moment, it felt almost like the old days before everything fell apart. But there was something unsettled in Vivian's heart. The chest still sat in Grant's study. She had not told Nora about one last thing inside it, a sealed envelope with her name in Grant's handwriting. She had never opened it. Vivian hesitated for weeks, fearing what the words might say. But that night, with thunder crawling closer, something in her finally gave in. She walked to the study, the floorboards creaking beneath her slippers. The air was colder here, heavy with dust and memory. She sat at the desk, took the letter in her trembling hands, and slid it open. Grant's handwriting was shaky, but alive with his voice. "Vivian, if you're reading this, it means the sea has won. I never told you about the deal, the timber rights, the stocks, because I wanted to protect you. But there's more. There's something I did long ago that I can't carry to the grave without telling you." Vivian's pulse quickened. She read on, "Years before we married, there was another woman. Her name was Elise. She lived near Astoria, and when I left her, she was pregnant. I sent money for years through a lawyer, but I never went back. Nora has a half-sister somewhere out there. Her name is Margaret." The letter fell from Vivian's hands, her breath caught. The wind howled outside like a living thing, a half-sister. All these years, another child Grant never spoke of. "Mom," Nora's voice came from the doorway. "You okay?" Vivian turned, the letter half hidden beneath her palm. "Yes, the wind startled me." Nora walked in, wiping her hands on a towel. "Storm getting bad. The waves are hitting the rocks already." She glanced at the desk. "What's that?" Vivian forced a smile. "Just one of your father's old papers." Nora studied her face. "You're shaking." "Fine," Vivian whispered, but her eyes betrayed her. That night, when the power went out and the sea began to roar like thunder, Vivian couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to the house tremble, thinking of Elise, of Margaret, of all the truths that time had buried like driftwood beneath the tide. By morning, the storm had torn through the cliffs. Fences were gone, branches scattered, and the path down to the beach was nearly washed out. Nora stood at the window, wide-eyed. "It's worse than I thought." Vivian nodded. "Stay here, I'll check the shore." "Mom, no, it's dangerous." But Vivian was already pulling on her raincoat. Something in her heart pulled her toward the beach, a voice she couldn't name, a need to face what the storm had uncovered. The wind tore at her hood as she made her way down the path. The surf was wild, foaming, and furious. She could barely hear herself think. But then, in the distance, she saw something wedged among the rocks, a wooden box, half broken, half buried in seaweed. She stumbled toward it, boots slipping, heart hammering. The box looked old, its brass corners corroded by salt. She pried it open. Inside, waterlogged papers, faded photographs, a small locket. Inside the locket, a girl's face. Dark hair, soft smile. On the back, scratched letters read, "M. Locke, 1981. Vivian's hands went cold. Margaret, the sea had delivered the truth to her doorstep. She carried the box home through the rain. Nora met her at the door, panic in her voice. "Mom, you're soaked. What happened?" Vivian set the box on the table. "I found something, someone maybe." Nora frowned. "What do you mean?" Vivian opened the locket and handed it to her. Nora's expression changed, confusion, disbelief, and then a flicker of pain. "Who is she?" Vivian hesitated. Then quietly, "Your father's daughter, from before you were born." Silence, only the wind outside pressing against the glass. Nora stared at the photo, then at her mother. "You knew." "I just found out last night in a letter." Nora turned away, breathing hard. "So, he lied to both of us." Vivian reached out. "He loved you, Nora. He loved us both. But he made mistakes, ones he tried to hide. Maybe now we have a chance to make peace with them." Nora's voice trembled. "Peace? He left a stranger somewhere out there, Mom. A sister I never knew existed." Vivian nodded slowly. "Then maybe it's time we find her." The search began with old records, phone calls, and quiet prayers. Days turned to weeks. Each night, they sat by the fire with maps and lists of names. And somewhere in that process, Nora began to see her mother differently, not just as a fragile widow, but as a woman who had endured loss and carried secrets with grace. They found her at last, Margaret Holt, living in a small town near Astoria. A retired nurse, 50 years old, never married. When Vivian called her, the silence on the other end was long and trembling. "I always wondered," Margaret said softly, "if he ever told you about me." "No," Vivian whispered. "He didn't, but the sea, it found a way to tell me." Laughed quietly, her voice thick with tears. "The sea always remembers." They agreed to meet. When Nora saw Margaret for the first time, she froze. The resemblance was undeniable. Same eyes, same smile. Two lives separated by time and secrets. They talked for hours by the shore, the sound of waves blending with laughter and tears. Vivian watched them, her heart breaking and healing at once. Later that night, back home, Nora stood by the window watching lightning far out at sea. "He kept so many secrets, Mom, and yet somehow they found their way back," joined her. "Because the sea doesn't keep secrets forever." They stood there in silence, the storm fading into distant rumble. And in that quiet, something inside both women finally settled, a fragile peace born from truth. But peace never lasts long on the coast. 3 weeks later, Nora received a letter, thick, official, sealed with a corporate stamp. She tore it open and gasped. "What is it?" Vivian asked. Nora read aloud, her voice shaking. "A claim against Dad's timber shares. Someone's contesting ownership. They say the assets belong to Elise Holt, Margaret's mother." Vivian's hand tightened on the chair. "What?" The letter fluttered in Nora's trembling fingers. Outside, the wind began to rise again, whispering through the pines like an old, familiar warning. The sea was quiet the morning the letter arrived, unnervingly quiet, as if it were holding its breath. The fog hung thick over the cliffs, and the world seemed made of whispers and gray. Vivian stood at the window, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold again, watching the horizon vanish into mist. Downstairs, Nora's voice carried faintly tense, hushed. She was on the phone with the lawyer. "Yes, I understand," Nora said. "But my father's will was clear. The estate was in my mother's name after his passing. He never mentioned any transfer." A pause, then her tone hardened. "We're not giving up what's ours." Vivian closed her eyes. The words stung, even though she knew they came from fear. Nora had changed, yes, softer, more grounded, but money had a strange way of stirring old ghosts. The claim from Elise Holt's estate had reopened every wound the sea had ever carved. The lawyer representing Margaret's mother's line insisted that the timber rights and stock grants were made before Grant married Vivian, meaning part of it, possibly half, legally belonged to Elise's descendants, which meant Margaret. That evening, Margaret came to the house. The three women sat around the wooden table, the locket lying between them like a silent witness. "I didn't file the claim," Margaret said gently. "I didn't even know about it until the lawyer contacted me." Vivian studied her face. Margaret looked so much like Grant that for a moment, it was painful to meet her eyes. "Do you believe it's yours?" Margaret hesitated. "Honestly, I don't know. My mother died years ago. She never spoke of any shares or money. I thought maybe he just forgot about us." Nora exhaled sharply. "Forgot? He hid you, from us, from me." "Enough," Vivian said quietly, her voice firm but kind. "The sea hides things, Nora. It doesn't mean it forgets them." Nora turned away, folding her arms. The firelight flickered across her face, part shadow, part sorrow. Margaret looked down at her hands. "If there's anything I'm owed, I don't want it in money. I'd rather have the truth." Vivian nodded slowly. "Then maybe that's what we all deserve." Next weeks were a blur of papers and signatures. The lawyers fought, numbers shifted, and old records were unearthed. But something unexpected began to happen. Vivian, Nora, and Margaret began to talk. About Grant, about their different memories of him. Margaret remembered a man who sent letters once a year, kind, apologetic, but distant. Nora remembered a father who built sandcastles and whispered bedtime stories about the sea. Vivian remembered a husband who never stopped looking westward, as if the horizon were calling him home. One evening, after a long day of legal meetings, the three of them sat on the back porch watching the sun bleed red into the ocean. Margaret said quietly, "Do you ever wonder if he knew this would happen? That someday we'd all find each other?" Vivian smiled sadly. Grant wasn't a man of planning, he was a man of tides. Things came to him and drifted away, but maybe this was the tide returning. Nora reached for her mother's hand, then Margaret's. "If he did, then maybe he wanted us to finish what he couldn't." Vivian looked at their joined hands, three women bound by love and loss, and thought maybe the storm had finally passed. But the sea had one more lesson left to give. A week later, another storm rolled in wilder than the last. The sky turned black before sunset, and waves pounded the cliffs like angry drums. The electricity flickered, then died. Vivian stood by the window again, watching lightning claw the horizon. Nora and Margaret were out. They had gone into town for supplies, promising to return before dark. But darkness had come faster than expected. As the wind screamed and rain battered the windows, Vivian's heart began to pound. She lit the old lantern and whispered, "Please, let them get home safe." Minutes turned to hours. Then, faintly through the roar of the storm, came headlights cutting through the fog. A car horn. Then a sound, a crash of metal and breaking glass. Vivian's breath caught. She dropped the lantern, grabbed her coat, and ran into the night. The rain was a wall. The wind pushed against her with the strength of years. She stumbled down the slick path, heart hammering, calling their names, Nora, Margaret. The car had skidded off near the bend, wedged against the guardrail. The headlights flickered weakly through the rain. Vivian wrenched the door open. Nora was there, bruised but conscious. Margaret was beside her, bleeding from a cut on her forehead. Nora's voice cracked. "We're okay. The road, it just..." Vivian pulled them both close, her body shaking. "Thank God." Storm howled above them, but in that moment it felt distant, like the sea had spent all its rage and was finally weeping. By morning, the sky cleared. The cliff steamed in the early light, washed clean. Nora and Margaret rested inside, bandaged and exhausted. Vivian sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, staring at the endless water. She thought of everything: Grant's secrets, Nora's fall and return, Margaret's forgiveness. She thought of how much the sea had taken and how much it had given back. When Nora woke, she found her mother writing something at the table, a letter, signed in elegant, steady handwriting. "What's that?" she asked softly. Vivian smiled. "A new will. I've decided something." Nora frowned. "Mom, you don't need to. I do," Vivian said gently. "Half of the estate will go to Margaret, the other half to fund the coastal cleanup foundation you started. No more empires, no more retreats, just something real, something that gives back." Nora's eyes filled with tears. "Mom, are you sure?" Vivian nodded. "Yes, your father's money came from the earth, from the forests and the sea. It's time it returns to them." Margaret stepped into the room, her hair still damp, her face pale but calm. "You don't have to do that for me." Vivian reached across the table, taking both their hands. "It's not for you. It's for him, for all of us." The three women sat in silence, the morning light pouring through the windows. The sea outside was calm, not still, but breathing, alive. Vivian looked out at the waves and whispered, "Grant, you can rest now." Months passed. The cleanup foundation grew quietly without fame or cameras. Veterans, fishermen, children, they came, helped, and stayed. Nora led meditation groups for them by the shore, her voice steady, her heart finally anchored. Margaret oversaw logistics, paperwork, and the endless stream of volunteers, and Vivian, she watched. Every evening, she'd walk the beach alone, her footsteps tracing the line where sea met sand. Sometimes she'd imagine Grant walking beside her, silent, smiling. One dusk, Nora joined her. They stood side by side, watching the waves turn gold under the sinking sun. Nora said softly, "You ever regret not leaving this place?" Vivian shook her head. "No, the world leaves you soon enough. But the sea, it always stays." They stood there a long time, until the last light faded and the stars came out, bright and patient. Vivian turned toward her daughter, her voice barely above the wind. "You know, Nora, the sea never really forgives, but it teaches you how to." Nora smiled faintly, tears glimmering. "Then I guess we've learned enough." They walked home together, the surf whispering behind them, carrying the sound of their laughter into the endless dark. Years later, after Vivian's passing, the Coastal Foundation continued under Nora and Margaret's care. A plaque stood near the cliff edge overlooking the sea. It read, "For those the tides took, and those they brought back in memory of Vivian Locke, who taught us that peace isn't found in paradise, but in forgiveness." And below, carved faintly in the wood, a simple line Grant had once written in his old logbook. "The sea doesn't keep secrets. It only waits for us to listen." The waves rolled against the rocks, eternal, restless, alive, and the coast, once haunted by grief, now breathed with peace.